The cabin sat where no cabin should. In the Sangre de Cristo foothills of 1884, a man built his home on the valley floor, near the creek. It was the law of common sense. Water was life, and flat ground was the only sensible place to build, to plow, to exist. Every other homestead in the narrow valley followed this rule, their dark log shapes huddled near the cottonwoods that traced the path of the water. But one structure defied the logic of an entire frontier. 40 feet up the north-facing slope, perched on a stony bench of land, sat the cabin of Uli Brunschweiler. It looked lonely, exposed, and profoundly foolish. From the valley floor, it seemed to be clinging to the mountainside, a testament to either ignorance or profound stubbornness. To get to it, a man had to climb. To get water to it, a man had to haul every bucket up that same 40-foot grade. Down in the valley, the other homesteaders watched him build through the late summer and into the fall. They were a community of practical people, hardened by experience, and they knew a mistake when they saw one. Garrett Pelham, a man whose own cabin was perfectly sited on a flat expanse beside the creek, voiced the consensus. "He'll break his back hauling water by Christmas," Pelham told anyone who would listen. "And when the north wind comes over that ridge, it'll peel his roof off like a tin can lid. The man's a fool." It was a perfectly reasonable assumption. The valley floor offered shelter from the wind. The creek offered easy water. The flat land was a gift. Uli Brunschweiler had rejected all of it. The question nobody could answer, the question that hung in the crisp autumn air with the scent of pine and coming snow, was why. Why would a man choose a life of such obvious, back-breaking difficulty when an easier path was right at his feet? The answer, when it came, would not be found in logic they understood. It would be written in the air itself. If you stay with this story, I promise you will learn a fundamental principle of how the natural world works, an invisible force that governs warmth and cold in mountainous terrain. It's a piece of forgotten wisdom that allowed a lone innovator to build a warm home, with less work, not more. To understand how he did it, consider subscribing and liking this video, and tell us in the comments, what's the cleverest piece of old-world knowledge you've ever encountered? Uli Brunschweiler was not a farmer. A farmer saw the world as a collection of fields, and to his eyes, the rich, dark soil of the valley bottom was paradise. Uli was not a prospector who saw a creek as a tool for washing gravel and a source of potential wealth. He was not a trapper who saw the forest as a series of game trails and water sources. Uli Brunschweiler was a Swiss alpine dairyman, and he saw the world as a landscape of air. He had grown up in a high valley in the canton of Glarus, a place where the mountains were not scenery, but the very engine of life. His hands were shaped by the smooth, worn wood of milking stools and the heavy heft of copper cheese vats. His memory was a catalog of sounds: the specific clatter of a cowbell in a thick fog, the scrape of a wooden rake on a steep hay meadow, the low groan of a glacier in the summer sun. He had spent his youth moving his family's herd up the slopes in spring and back down in autumn, a seasonal migration dictated by the growth of grass. But his father had taught him something more valuable than animal husbandry. He had taught him to read the air. In the Alps, they had a name for it: Kaltluftsee, the cold air lake. His father had shown him how, on a clear and windless night, the coldest, heaviest air would slide off the high peaks and glaciers, flowing down the slopes like invisible water, pooling in the lowest parts of the valley. You couldn't see it, but you could feel it. You could see its effects. The lowest pastures were the last to lose their frost in the morning. The chalets built in the hollows were always the dampest, the hardest to keep warm. The wise builders, the old families, always sited their homes and barns not at the very bottom, but on a slight rise, a bench of land part way up the slope, above the reach of that nightly flood of cold. "Let the cold flow past you, Whaley," his father used to say, gesturing down into the valley. "Don't build your house in the bottom of the river." When his wife, Anya, passed from fever, the old world lost its color. The mountains he had loved became gray reminders of a shared life now gone. With his 15-year-old nephew Lucas, whose parents had sent him along for a better life in the New World, Whaley packed a single trunk and left Switzerland forever. He sought not a new life, but a quiet one. The Colorado Rockies looked like a wilder, grander version of his home, and he filed a claim in a valley in the Sangre de Cristos, hoping to find peace. They spent their first winter, that of 1883, in a rented shack on the valley floor, and it was there that Whaley recognized the old enemy. The cold in Colorado was different, drier, sharper, but its behavior was identical. He watched the smoke from their chimney rise a few feet and then flatten out, trapped under a ceiling of warmer air above. Inside the cabin, their breath hung in the air all day long, a constant fog. When Lucas went to the well in the morning, the rope was stiff, each fiber frozen solid. The lamp oil in the can was as thick as molasses. It would barely pour. They burned through a staggering amount of wood, yet the cold was a physical presence, a guest that never left. It seeped through the log walls, radiated from the frozen ground, and settled in the corners of the small room. Whaley saw his neighbors doing the same, their chimneys pluming smoke from dawn till dusk, fighting a battle they could not win. They had all built their homes in the bottom of the river. The failure of the valley cabins was not a failure of construction. Garrett Pelham's home was a model of frontier craftsmanship. The logs were saddle-notched and fit tightly. The gaps were chinked with a mixture of mud and grass, so dense that not a whisper of wind could penetrate it. His stove was a modern cast-iron wonder, purchased at great expense from a catalog. By every known standard of the day, his cabin should have been a fortress against the cold. Yet it was a miserably cold place to live. The problem wasn't the cabin, it was the ground it stood on. Every night the physics of the mountains worked against it. As the sun set, the rocky peaks and high slopes of the Sangre de Cristos began to rapidly lose their heat to the clear, dark sky. The air in contact with this cooling ground grew cold, and as it cooled, it became denser and heavier. This dense, heavy air refused to stay put. Gravity took hold, and it began to slide downhill, a slow, silent, and invisible avalanche of cold. It flowed down every ravine and draw, a network of frigid tributaries feeding a great river of cold that poured onto the valley floor. There, with nowhere lower to go, it pooled. The valley, which seemed like a sanctuary during the day, became a basin, a natural reservoir for the coldest air the mountains could produce. By midnight, the homesteads of Pelham and his neighbors were submerged in it, sitting at the bottom of a lake of air that could be 15 or 20 degrees colder than the air just 50 feet up the slope. They were fighting a war on two fronts. They were losing heat from their cabins into the surrounding air, a process called conduction. Every log, every pane of glass, every nailhead was a bridge for BT-us to escape into the cold. But they were also losing the war against infiltration. The immense pressure of the cold, dense air outside meant that it was constantly trying to force its way in. It found microscopic cracks in the chinking. It slipped under the door. It flowed down the chimney when the fire died down. The result was a perpetual, soul-crushing dampness. The moisture from their breath, from cooking, from washing, had nowhere to go. It condensed on the cold interior walls, forming a sheen of frost. Blankets were always clammy. The packed dirt floor felt like a block of ice. To stay warm, they had to overheat the air inside the cabin with the stove, burning through their precious wood piles at an alarming rate. But the moment the stove was damped down for the night, the cold reclaimed the space with astonishing speed. They would wake in the morning to find a skin of ice in the water bucket just feet from the cold stove. They were living in a thermal sink, and no amount of firewood could ever fill it up. They had chosen the land that was easiest to work, and in doing so, had sentenced themselves to a winter of relentless, exhausting, and expensive cold. The following August, Uli Brunschweiler walked the length of the valley, his eyes not on the soil at his feet, but on the slopes above. Young Lucas trailed behind him, confused. They passed several prime, unclaimed parcels of bottomland, land with rich soil and easy access to the creek. Lucas pointed them out, but Whaley just shook his head and kept climbing. He stopped on a rocky, scrub-covered bench, a relatively flat spot on the steep northern slope. It was 40 vertical feet above the valley floor. The ground was thin and stony, useless for farming. The creek was a distant shimmer below. "Here," Whaley said, driving a wooden stake into the ground. "We will build here." Lucas was aghast. "But uncle, the water, the fields?" Whaley pointed down. "The cold is for down there. The warmth is for up here." The building began. It was brutally hard work. Every log had to be skidded uphill. Every stone for the foundation had to be levered into place on the uneven ground. Their work became a source of daily curiosity for the settlers below. Riders would pause on the valley trail, squinting up at the two figures toiling on the slope. The consensus was swift and uncharitable. The Swiss man was touched in the head. Garrett Pelham made a point of riding up one afternoon. He was not an unkind man, but he was a man who believed in proven ways. He sat atop his horse, looking at the half-finished walls of the cabin, then down the steep, clumsy path Whaley and Lucas had worn to the creek. "Brunschweiler," he said, his voice direct but not hostile. "I don't mean to tell you your business, but hauling water uphill every day breaks a man's back by spring. There's good land down by the cottonwoods, still time to build there before the snow flies." Whaley paused, leaning on the handle of his axe. He looked at Pelham, then at the valley floor, then back at his own chosen spot. "The water is heavy," he said, his English still thick with a German accent. "But the cold is heavier." Pelham just shook his head, convinced he was dealing with a stubborn fool. He turned his horse and rode away. "Don't come to me begging for firewood in January," he muttered to himself. As the aspens on the high slopes turned a brilliant, fiery yellow, Uli performed a ritual that cemented his nephew's faith and would have baffled his neighbors completely. One evening, just after dusk, when the air was perfectly still, he lit a lantern. He handed it to Lucas. "Walk down the path," he instructed. "Slowly. Hold the lantern out. When the flame changes, you stop and call to me." Lucas did as he was told, walking carefully down the slope. He held the lantern out, its steady yellow flame a small beacon in the growing twilight. He walked 10 yards, then 20. The flame burned calmly. Then, as he took a few more steps downward, something remarkable happened. The flame, which had been a placid, upright teardrop of light, suddenly seemed to shiver. It flickered and danced, and its top edge turned a smoky orange. It was as if he had walked through an invisible door. "Now!" Lucas shouted, his voice full of surprise. "It is dancing now." "Good," Whaley called back. He walked to the spot on the slope directly above where Lucas stood and drove a tall stake into the ground. "That is the shoreline," he said later as they sat by their fire. "Below that stake is the lake of cold air. We are building on the high bank." From then on, Lucas worked with a silent, determined understanding. He finally saw that they weren't just building a structure of wood and stone. They were building a home on a foundation of pure physics. They finished the roof just as the first snows began to dust the highest peaks. Down below, the other settlers, secure in their logical, sensible cabins, laid in their massive stores of firewood, and braced for the winter. Up on the slope, Uli Brunschweiler, the fool, calmly did the same. But his woodpile was conspicuously smaller. To understand what Uli Brunschweiler knew, you have to stop thinking of air as a uniform, invisible gas. You have to start thinking of it as a fluid, like water, with currents, layers, and varying densities. The engine that drives this system is simple. Cold air is denser and therefore heavier than warm air. On a grand scale, this principle creates our global wind patterns, but on the micro scale of a single mountain valley, it creates a phenomenon known as cold air drainage, or katabatic wind. Imagine the valley as a large bathtub. During the day, the sun warms all the surfaces, the slopes, the trees, the valley floor. The air becomes buoyant and circulates, but after sunset, especially on a clear, cloudless night, the land begins to radiate its heat back into space very quickly. The ground gets cold, and it chills the layer of air directly in contact with it. This thin layer of chilled air, now heavier than the air around it, begins to obey the law of gravity. It starts to slide downhill. From every direction, cold air drains off the higher elevations and flows towards the lowest possible point. It is a silent, invisible river. This river fills the bathtub of the valley from the bottom up. This process creates a temperature inversion. Normally, as you go up in altitude, the air gets colder. But in this situation, the opposite is true for the first few hundred feet. The coldest air is pooled at the very bottom of the valley. As you move up the slope, the temperature actually increases because you are climbing out of that lake of cold, dense air. This warmer band of air clinging to the mountainside is called the thermal belt. The temperature difference can be dramatic. On a calm, clear winter night, the valley floor might register minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, while a point just 40 or 50 feet up the slope, in the heart of the thermal belt, could be a relatively balmy minus 5 degrees. That's a 20-degree difference achieved for free. It's a gift of the landscape, a passive heating system that requires no fuel, no stove, no effort, only the knowledge of where to place your home. The settlers on the valley floor were living at the bottom of this thermal bathtub. Their cabins were constantly losing heat to an environment that was fundamentally, physically colder. They were trying to heat a small box while it was submerged in an ocean of frigid air. The amount of energy, measured in British thermal units or BTUs, required to counteract this constant drain was enormous. Every log they burned was fighting a losing battle against the relentless physics of the valley. Uli Brunschweiler, by placing his cabin 40 feet up, had simply refused to fight that battle. He had built his home on the shore, above the high water mark of the Kaltluftsee. His cabin still lost heat to the outside, of course, but it was losing it to air that was 20 degrees warmer. The thermal load, the demand on his stove and his woodpile, was drastically, fundamentally lower. He wasn't smarter because he built a better cabin. He was smarter because he chose a better location, letting the mountain itself do half the work of staying warm. The winter arrived not as a gradual decline, but as an invading army. In the second week of January, a mass of Arctic air, brutally cold and dense, slid down from the north and settled over the Rockies. The sky turned a crystalline, unforgiving blue. The sun was a distant, heatless disk. For 9 straight days, the temperature on the valley floor did not rise above 10 degrees below zero, and at night it plunged to a soul-crushing 25 below. Then, the winds began. Unpredictable Chinook currents wrestled with the Arctic air mass, causing the winds on the high ridges to shift and gust, first from the north, then the west, a daily battle in the upper atmosphere. Down in the valley, life ground to a frozen halt. It was too cold to work outside. The creek froze over, a thick, 3-foot layer of ice that had to be chopped through with an axe to get water. Garrett Pelham's world shrank to the space of his small cabin. The logs of his home groaned in the cold, contracting so much that thin veins of frost appeared in the chinking. Ice on the inside of his single window pane grew into a thick, opaque sheet of milky white. They kept the stove roaring, a desperate, constant effort. The air inside was thick with wood smoke and the smell of damp wool. Despite the fire, a bucket of water set 10 feet from the stove would develop a skin of ice. His wife wrapped their youngest child in every blanket they owned, yet the boy's cough echoed in the small space. Pelham burned through a week's worth of firewood in 3 days. He looked at his dwindling woodpile with a growing sense of dread. He and his neighbors were trapped, living in a state of thermal siege. 40 feet up the slope, Uli and Lucas lived in a different world. Their cabin was an island of calm in the frozen landscape. From the outside, it looked just as beleaguered as the others, with snow drifted against its walls and a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. But the smoke rose lazily, a sign of a slow, steady fire, not a desperate, roaring blaze. Inside, the difference was absolute. The air was cool but comfortable, and most importantly, it was dry. There was no frost on the inside of their window. Lucas could sit at their small table and read a book by lamplight without his fingers growing numb. Uli went about his chores with a quiet efficiency. The defining feature of their home was not warmth, but normalcy. Life continued. The proof was in the small things, the details that would have been impossible down below. One morning, with the temperature on the valley floor at its absolute low, Uli needed to refill the lamp. He took the tin of oil from a shelf on their small, covered porch, where it was exposed to the ambient air. He tipped the can. The oil, a vital fluid that congealed into a useless sludge in Pelham's shed, poured out in a clean, thin, liquid stream. It was a small miracle. The numerical contrast was stark. A thermometer Uli had hung on his porch read -6 degrees. Down at Pelham's cabin, a similar instrument was frozen at its lowest peg, 25 below zero. A 19-degree difference created not by a wall or a fire, but by 40 feet of elevation. The image contrast was even more powerful. In the valley, every surface was armored in frost. Every movement was a painful battle, every breath a visible cloud. On Ueli's small perch, the world was still, cold, and quiet. He had not built a fortress against the winter. He had simply stepped aside and let its most brutal expression, the river of cold, pass harmlessly beneath him. The vindication of Uli Brunschweiler's strange choice came not from a pronouncement or an argument, but from a snapped strand of wire and a cold man's reluctant climb. Garrett Pelham's property line ran from the creek all the way up the slope, past Uli's claim. The fence was old, and in the profound cold, the metal wire had contracted until, with a sound like a gunshot in the frozen air, one of the strands had snapped. His cattle, desperate for any forage, could wander. It had to be mended. He set out from his cabin an hour after dawn. The cold was a physical assault. The air was so dense it seemed to resist his movement. His breath froze instantly on his beard, encasing it in a cage of ice. Every homesteader knew a fundamental truth. The higher you climb, the colder and windier it gets. This was the certainty that governed his world. His task was miserable, but the physics were simple. He was walking from a cold place to a colder one. He began the climb, his boots crunching loudly on the dry, powdery snow. The tools in his hand were so cold they burned through his mittens. For the first 30 feet of elevation, the world remained as he knew it. The air was a razor, scraping at any exposed patch of skin. His lungs ached with each inhalation. He kept his head down, focused only on the task. His mind, a dull litany of curses against the winter the fence, and his own bad luck. Then he walked through the invisible wall. It was not a sudden blast of warmth. It was far more subtle and far more profound. The stinging, biting quality of the air simply vanished. He stopped, confused. He thought perhaps the wind had shifted, but the air was dead calm. He took another 10 steps up the slope, his senses on high alert. There it was again. The air against his cheeks felt different. It was still deeply cold, but the painful, aggressive edge was gone. It felt soft. He stood there for a full minute, utterly perplexed. This violated a law of nature as he knew it. He pulled off his right mitten, a risky move in such temperatures. He held his bare hand up. Down below, the air had felt like a solid thing, a block of ice that stole heat with savage speed. Here it felt merely like cold air. He could feel the individual chill on his knuckles, but it wasn't the ravenous cold of the valley floor. He flexed his fingers. They were stiff, but they obeyed. He climbed another 20 feet, reaching the level of Willie's cabin, which was now visible through the sparse winter trees. The warmth was undeniable. A wave of air, easily 15 or 20 degrees warmer than what he had just left, enveloped him. He looked back down the way he had come, into the frozen basin of the valley, as if looking into the depths of a lake. He saw the tops of his own cottonwood trees, the roof of his own cabin, all submerged in that pool of brutal cold. And he was standing on the shore. He saw it all in an instant. The back-breaking work of hauling water, the seemingly foolish location, the smaller woodpile. It wasn't madness. It was a form of genius so simple and so profound it was almost invisible. The Swiss hadn't built on a foolish piece of ground. He had built on a wiser piece of air. Pelham stood on the mountainside, the cold tools forgotten in his hand, and stared at the quiet cabin where a man was living an entirely different winter. The lowest ground looked safest, and it was the coldest place a man could stand. The valley floor was a river of cold, and Uli Brunschweiler had built his home on the bank. Garrett Pelham fixed his fence, but he carried something far more valuable back down the slope with him: the truth. He was a practical man, not given to pride when facts stood against him. He told his wife first, then his closest neighbors. The story was too strange, too contrary to experience to be believed at first. But Pelham was a respected man, and his testimony was hard to dismiss. He described the feeling of walking out of a freezer, the undeniable warmth on his own skin. The story spread through the small community, passed over frozen wellheads and in front of roaring stoves. It became a piece of local lore. That spring, when the thaw came, visitors made their way up to Uli's cabin, not to mock but to ask questions. Uli, a man of few words, would simply point down into the valley. "The cold lives there," he would say. "I live here." He shared his knowledge freely, explaining the simple principle his father had taught him. The true agent of the idea's spread, however, was not a homesteader, but a clerk. In the land office in town sat a man named Silas Croft, a meticulous draftsman whose job was to record claims on the official plat maps. He was a man of lines and numbers, and when he heard Pelham's story, it appealed to his orderly mind. It was a variable he had never considered: elevation as an asset not for its view, but for its warmth. The next time a new family of settlers came in, looking to file a claim in that valley, Silas did something new. He pulled out the topographical survey maps. With a pencil, he lightly sketched in the contour lines on the simpler plat map. He pointed to the steep lines of the valley walls. "The bottomland is good for grazing," Silas explained, tapping the flat area by the creek. "But the old hands are saying the winters are hard down there. They say the cold pools up. The smart money," he said, his pencil tracing a line some 50 feet above the valley floor, "is building right about here. In the thermal belt, they're starting to call it It was a revolution in land valuation. That year, of the 12 new claims filed in the valley and its adjacent draws, 7 were for mid-slope parcels. The prime real estate was no longer the flat land by the water. It was the stony, inconvenient, but demonstrably warmer benches on the hillside. Within a few years, the pattern of settlement had been permanently altered. Cabins began to appear in a distinct line along the valley walls, a testament to a shared, hard-won piece of knowledge. Uli Brunschweiler's idea, born in the Swiss Alps, had taken root in the Rockies. The principle Uli Brunschweiler utilized is not a forgotten piece of folklore. It is a fundamental concept in modern building science and agriculture. Today we call this nightly flow of cold, dense air katabatic drainage. The warmer zone it creates on the slopes is known scientifically as a thermal belt. Fruit growers have understood this for centuries, planting their valuable orchards on hillsides to protect the delicate blossoms from the late spring frosts that pool in the valleys. Architects and designers specializing in passive, energy-efficient homes still use this principle, siting houses to take advantage of microclimates and avoid these natural cold sinks. Ueli's simple, profound observation was an early, intuitive application of what is now a well-documented scientific reality. The story of the cabin on the slope is a story about heat and cold, about BTUS and thermal inversions, but its deepest lesson is about the nature of wisdom. The homesteaders in the valley followed a set of rules that had served humanity for millennia: live near water, build on flat ground. Their logic was flawless, born of universal experience. It was, by all accounts, the safest and most sensible choice. And yet, it was wrong. It was wrong because it failed to account for an invisible force, a hidden architecture of the landscape that governed their comfort and survival. The lowest ground, the path of least resistance, looked like a sanctuary, but was, in fact, a trap. True safety lay in the harder path, the steeper climb, the choice that seemed to defy all common sense. Uli Brunschweiler survived and thrived not because he was a better builder or a harder worker, but because he carried a different kind of map in his head, one that showed the currents of the air, not just the contours of the land. He did not conquer the Colorado winter. He simply saw it for what it was, respected its power, and politely stepped out of its way. He chose not to live where the winter was strongest, and in that single, simple decision, he found a warmth that no amount of firewood could ever buy. If this story of frontier ingenuity and forgotten physics resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more tales of practical wisdom. Let us know in the comments what other invisible forces of nature shape our world in ways we rarely notice. Thank you for watching. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and meteorological phenomena. Any application of these building concepts today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.